Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the S voiceless and Z voiced Z sounds today. The correct production of S and Z can be made in two different ways. The first way is an apico-alveolar production. This is where the tongue tip is up and the active articulator is the apex and the passive articulator is the alveolar ridge. There is a narrow opening between the tongue tip and the alveolar ridge, and the lateral edges of the tongue must be elevated and touch the first molars to avoid lateral air escape. The second production is a pre-dorsal alveolar production, and this is where the tongue tip is down behind the lower incisors. The active articulator is the front portion of the tongue, and the passive articulator is the alveolar ridge. The tongue arches toward the alveolar ridge, leaving a narrow opening between the pre-dorsal section of the tongue and the alveolar ridge. The lateral edges of the tongue must be elevated, similar to the apico-alveolar production. The sound is one of the top 5 sounds in frequency occurrence, and the Z sound ranks around the 11th in consonant sounds. In the speech of first, second, and third grade children, it was shown that half of the S sounds occurred in the initial position of the word. The other half was divided between the medial and final positions. With the Z sound, more than 90% of the sounds were found in the final position of the word. Word final clusters ending with S or Z, Z can be used to signal plurality, such as books, coats, third person singular, such as he jumps, or a possessive, such as moms, dads. Incorrect productions of S and Z can happen in multiple ways. An interdental and adental production of S and Z is a frequent and most common form of distortion. The tongue tip is too close to the posterior surface of upper incisors, and the tongue placement being too far forward results in crossing phonemic boundaries to the Th sound. A lateral production is when lateral airflow, tip of the tongue, is in direct contact with the alveolar ridge. This results in no sagittal grooving of the tongue and a lateral lisp. A palatal production is when there is more palatal placement of active and passive articulators. This is where the position is too far back, and this causes the sagittal grooving of the tongue to be more flattened than usual for S and Z. A strident production is when there is a shrill, irritating auditory impression. It's a whistle-like component, and it is an imbalance between air pressure and the opening through which the air must flow. When this is happening, there's either too much air pressure or too narrow of an opening between the articulators. A nasal production is when the nasal air during the production is either organic or functional. An organic nasal results from physiological anomalies or neuromotor problems such as cleft palate or dysarthria. Functional nasality may be a result of articulatory dyspraxia, faulty learning of sound patterns, or maintenance of a learned pattern that was originally organic. There can also be a common substitution of T and D for S. And this is a change in manner of articulation called stopping, and that is when the tongue tip is in direct contact with the alveolar ridge. To help with the correct production of S and Z, we could recommend a child uses the pre-dorsal production of the sound. We would recommend this because the tongue tip is resting behind the lower incisor, and this provides an easy identifiable spot for the tongue tip that does not change throughout the entire production. We can also offer some sound modification methods, which are based on the concept of using a similar, appropriately articulated sound to aid in the production of the misarticulated sound. So if the child already has the sh sound, we can build off of this to change it into a S sound. We do this by 3 steps, the first one being eliminating the tongue rounding associated with the production of sh, and have the client smile while saying shh. Then we have the client move the tongue slightly forward to change the place where friction occurs. And lastly, we increase the sagittal grooving of the tongue and have the client raise the lateral edges of the tongue, touching the upper molars. Now, a different method for this, if you are treating a functional nasal problem with the production of s and z, you can use a method of consonant clusters of T and S, and then S and T. This uses the buildup of intraoral pressure of T to facilitate a non-nasal S production. And you would use words such as hits or bats to begin with, and then once the child has fully produced those correctly, 90% of the time, you can move on to words like stop and store. And that is a breakdown of the s and z sounds.